Well, thank you very much, John, for that very wonderful introduction. It's great to be here in Cardiff and with a sympathetic urban design audience. So the topic of my presentation is public space. This is a subject matter that it continues to become debated quite a lot, and there are some different ideas and views about public space and how it should be produced, provided, cared for, and things like that. Just to briefly, a little bit of a self-promotion here. I've been working on public space for a while. I mean, I had in the 90s, I had 2 grants from this wonderful institution called the National Endowment for the Arts in the U.S. But if Mitt Romney becomes the president, it will probably be history along with the Sesame Street and the Big Bird. But the National Endowment for the Arts gave me a couple of grants to look at. One was the sort of privatization of public spaces in downtown, and the second one was also doing a kind of invented streets. And based on that, and along with Anastasia Lukaitis-Sideris, who is a former student but now a colleague, a distinguished urban design academic herself, an associate dean now at UCLA. We did one article on what he called the negotiated plaza, which focused on how the urban spaces, public spaces, are actually produced in downtown U.S. cities. And then it led to their more complete book called Urban Design Downtown, Poetics and Politics of Form, where we looked at, as John pointed out, Los Angeles, San Francisco, also a space from downtown San Diego. And in that book also we focused on the production of I know that John himself is very much interested in that, how these spaces actually get produced. The role of the developer, the planner, the designer, the politicians, the architects. So the politics and poetics, implying that the poetics comes from the architect designer, their kind of romantic notion about what public space should be, and then the politics of different interest groups, private sector, business interests, and stuff like that. And then recently we did another piece. We were invited by Naomi Carmon from Technion University in Israel, and Susan Feinstein from, at that time, Harvard, where they put together a bunch of people to look at, looking at the future, planning for people, but what we learn from the past. This book hasn't come out yet. It's going to come out in 2013, I understand. But they asked us to do a piece on public space. So Anastasia and I did this article chapter called Suspicion, Surveillance, and Safety, a new imperative for public space. And then finally we have just another article coming out with also another former student and her husband, where we're looking at the emergence of the social media and the cyberspace and the implication for that for urban design and public space. So that's sort of a little bit of a self-promotion. For those of us who are hopelessly romantic about public space, these are some of the terms I think that kind of inspires you from time to time. So the famous German saying, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes one free, is an old medieval saying. Or in Arabic there is an expression says, let's go smell the air. I can't quite get the Arabic saying right yet. And then you all know about Henri Lefebvre, the French philosopher, his wonderful treatise on the right to the city, is the title of the book. And James Holston, who's an American anthropologist, also writes about spaces of insurgent citizenship, some of which actually predated what we saw recently in the Tridib Square and the streets of Arab uprising or the Occupy Wall Street. I mean, these are wonderful examples of political expressions, demand for freedom and citizenship, but using the public space, the streets and squares, as a forum for that kind of display of expression of political rights. Now, the cities are changing dramatically, and some of this has to do with the more developing countries, especially in the new, what they call the emerging economies. The cities are growing enormously. There's a very growing number of fairly prosperous people, but there's also quite a bit of poverty and poor people. But it's simply that these cities are growing enormously at a fast pace, have a lot of kind of urban sprawl and so forth. But it's not clear that these cities have been able to keep pace with the growth of population that's taking place. So there is a sort of a serious shortage, and one might argue a deficit of the conventional public spaces like parks, playgrounds, and other recreational spaces. So as a result, what you have is a kind of a congested lung of the city, right? I mean, there is not enough open spaces or thought about at the lung of the city. Well, the lung is getting a little bit congested because the supply of open space has not kept up with the demand for such facilities. And so what happened is that those who can afford, the wealthy and the prosperous, they retreat to their private spaces, a phenomenon that Robert Reich, who is to be the labor secretary under the Clinton administration, called secession of the successful. I should put them in the quotation marks. But there is also a broader, one could call the narrative of loss. And this is very much, kind of coming up in the writings in the American academic world, written not just by urban designers, but also sociologists and geographers, political theorists, sort of a broad spectrum of people who normally one wouldn't think would be interested in design of public space, but they're now very much interested in public space and urban design. So one of the sort of the part of the narrative of loss, a sense of kind of a loss, something that's changing, is the privatization of public space. Although one might argue whether we should really be calling it publicization of private space. But basically the private public spaces, so-called public spaces that are provided by the developers, property owners, corporations, because cities don't have money, they're usually bankrupt, to buy land, and the land is expensive in the middle of the city, so they are now sort of outsourcing, so to speak, the process of providing public space to the private sector, business corporations and things like that. So what the implication, possible exclusion of, quote, unholy and unwashed, as Lynn Laughlin says, and in fact I don't consider myself unholy or unwashed, but I was asked to leave the premises of a shopping mall, one with the threat of being arrested, and this happened in the Mall of the Americans, not in Minneapolis, but the town next to Minneapolis. And my crime, so to speak, was that I was taking pictures. In another place also, in Pasadena, the security guard came and asked me to leave. So I said, what's wrong with taking pictures? It was a public space. They said, no, you cannot take pictures, too many pictures. You can take one or two, but not too many. So I myself have faced this, experienced the process of being excluded or kicked out of some of these spaces. So there is a sort of a, kind of encumbrance of basic rights and freedom in the shopping malls. And the shopping malls have been kind of debated, at least some of the U.S., not this U.S. Supreme Court, but each state, 50 states, they have their own state Supreme Courts. And the state Supreme Courts have faced this question about, is shopping mall a public space? So that what can you do in a shopping mall? Can you distribute leaflets? Can you can you have a cookie bake to raise money? Can you do what you can do in Hyde Park, kind of get up on a soapbox and give your speech of your life? And none of these are particularly acceptable in the shopping malls. Now, it's interesting that in America, the states have different kind of political leaning. So more liberal states like Massachusetts, New York, California, the Supreme Court has ruled that basically if if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's a duck. So he said that if your shopping mall is something that looks like a public space, it functions like a public space, and you're asking people to come at a public space, it's a public space. But the shopping mall owners have given the right to at least control what you can do. So for example, when you're doing a survey in a shopping mall in California, you cannot distribute questionnaires. What you could do is you could set up a table in one corner of the main space with a sign, with the university sign, and say, you know, we're doing a study. If people voluntarily come and fill out the form, questionnaire, that's okay. But you cannot approach a customer to ask questions. We had one doctoral student who was determined to do a survey the users of the shopping mall. So he stood just immediately outside in the public sidewalk. As people came up, he gave them the questionnaires. So he was exercising his right in a public space, but not in a shopping mall, which is still a private space. So there, the argument is that you are there only as a privilege, not as a right. I mean, the shopping mall owner can ask you to leave. You can do pretty much everything you can do as long as you are, going to the restaurants or walking out with a shopping bag, but nothing else. You cannot just sort of hang around and like you can do in a park and sit there and read a book. They'll probably ask you to leave because, if you're not participating in the shopping activity, you are not really welcome there. So basically, these then leading to what some people argue is a kind of atrophying of the public realm that's seeming to be shrinking, and then the declining public life, which Richard Sennett, a sociologist, talked about it quite some time ago. And recently, or not so recently, in the 1992, Michael Sorkin, who edited that book, Variations on a Theme Park, the subtitle of that book, The New American City and the End of Public Space. So what he's arguing that the new American city, as you're emerging, basically there are no public space, the end of public space. Others like Trevor Boddy have talked about emergence of analogous city, that is, as parts become privatized, some people have their own enclosed areas, passageways, streets, separated by levels. So they live in a kind of analogous city, which is different from the true city where everybody belongs. So there's a kind of parallel reality that emerges in this process. And those of you know Mike Davis, who wrote a book called City of Courts in Los Angeles. There's one chapter that's titled Fortress Los Angeles, which talks about basically the closed circuit television and other kinds of surveillance that actually creates a kind of fortress-like environment. And Ed Blakely and Mary Gail Snyder did a very nice book studying the gated communities in America, and the title of their book was Fortress America. And Blakely himself wrote a very nice piece for the Planning magazine one time, where he concludes by saying, how can you have a social contract, which is part of a true kind of society, if we don't have social contact. So these are some examples of what I call the narrative of loss. Now, the concept of the public, one could think about that. At least there are four intellectual traditions in which notion of public has been addressed. One comes from the political theory, which deals with the notion of citizenship, the public sphere, democracy, civil society, and the like. Then there is a sort of a literature of social theory, which focuses on social life, social contact, sociability, civility, conviviality, community, and public life, those kinds of things. There are feminist theory, who focus on the family and the household, or the household and the political community. But I'm not going to touch the feminist theory too much, because I'm not sure I have a full grasp on it. But I appreciate some of their argument. In fact, the feminist theory actually have challenged those narrative of loss I just showed. So what are you guys talking about? You're kind of romanticizing about Greek agora being the true public space. Was it really public space? The Greeks didn't allow women to be in the agora. The women were not debating the affairs of the state. The slaves were not allowed there. So, you know, to romanticize about the Greek agora as a public space, you were completely, you know, you don't know what you're talking about. So I think there's some argument there. And also, they have some very interesting, in the Middle East, for example, in a developing country, they argue the public space is basically a male space. So it's kind of a gender. So when the Arab women walk into the public street, they're completely covered up. They say it's like becoming invisible because they're intruding. The women are not supposed to be in the male space. So when they're intruding, they better cover themselves up. So this is the notion of male domination of public space. The gender theories have some very, very interesting angle, but I'm going to leave that, although we could talk about how there's an interesting research topic to see you know, who uses public space, what percentage are men, how percentage are women, and if there are any kind of changes and all that. And then finally, the liberal economic theory, the state and the market, public and private goods. And I was hoping that, well, Chris Webster isn't here, but Shin Lee might be here. I don't know, I don't see her. Some of these thoughts are kind of actually stimulated by some of the writings of Chris Webster, who have been a very sort of in the forefront of some new ideas on thinking about public space and the public good and things like that. So let me move on quickly. So if you look at the political theory argument, so one argument is that this is the Margaret Cohn, a young political theorist from University of Toronto, writes about in her book Brave New Neighborhoods, Privatization of Public Space. She argues that the idea of public space is integral to the First Amendment right, which is the freedom of speech and expression. That it's so important that we have access to public space where we can express our opinion, our views, our expression, whether it's a political expression or artistic expression, that's very much part of our very essential First Amendment right. I mean, I'm using the American term, but I'm sure in the British there is similar kind of right. I don't know how it's which constitution, where it comes from, but it's equally valued in the UK. The second, of course, also similarly, the public space is essential for democracy, is important for democratic processes, and written by Benjamin Barber, who is a political theorist, not an urban designer, and he talks about a place of us, how to make society civil and democracy strong. And he argues that we need public space. The public space is really the important medium in which all of this could happen. And then there's Bickford, who also talks about similarly in the Journal of Political Theory about the importance of public space and citizenship and things like that. And of course we have the famous philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who talked about bourgeois public sphere as the entity that protects the individual from the state, and you know and although he doesn't address the public space part of it, but it's very much part of his notion of public sphere. So now I'll show you some pictures. So this is, for example, a good example of how these political expressions are used in the public space. So this happens to be a couple of years ago. There was a big, you know, the U.S. Congress has always been sort of dilly-dallying on a lot of the people without papers, so to speak, that illegal aliens, but who have been living for quite some time, they're working and all that. And in fact, some more conservative politicians have thought that, or argued that they should be all kicked out. You know, they don't belong here, they came here illegally, there is no room for them here. I'm sure that in the British politics there are similar views. So there was one day there was a big movement about sort of the immigrants claiming their citizenship, and basically this picture shows, you know, they're pushing these babies in strollers. The babies are all born in America, so they're all American citizens, and they're kind of waving big American flag. As you know, the Los Angeles city doesn't have any big public space, so this was happening in the streets, very much like in Arab streets where there is an expression. And even your archdiocese, which may not be, maybe a target of political expression. This archdiocese got into some labor dispute, so they set up the sign right outside their main cathedral in Los Angeles, and this is the kind of expression of your dissent, opinion expression that you're allowed in a truly public space. This is a scene from Mexico City in 2006, when the presidential election was very close, very, but Mexicans didn't go to the Supreme Court, had the Supreme Court decide who the president going to be. They took it to the street. So the party, which was Manuel Obrador, the winner was Feliz Calderon, whose term is just ending. And they just took over the entire Mexico City one day and came from all over Mexico. They were from rural areas and had the long marches, political speeches, billboards, and all that. The city was completely draped with this political dissent and opposition. And in the middle of the Mexico City, there's this big Zócalo, which is the laws of the Indies, the plaza, classic plaza that was built by the laws of the Indies. A lot of assembly and arguments, a discussion, and you see kids who came, probably stayed up all night, came from some outside Mexico City, decided to take a nap right in the middle, right smack in the middle of the plaza. Now that you can do that. That's what the public space allows you to do. The social theory, of course, which emphasizes the role of public space in our social life, in maintaining social contact, sociability, civility, community, and public life. These are some from city of Bologna, which is one of my favorite cities in Italy, and you see all of these kinds of social interaction taking place. The setting allows for that kind of engagement. And of course, in the U.S., you may know of William H. White's work, who actually did a interesting study for the New York City Planning Commission. The New York City had a what they call the incentive zoning, where the city was trying to promote more public spaces by requiring the developers to create public space in return for some additional FAR, floor area ratio. You have a different term for that here, right? What do you call it?
Planning gain.
Huh?
Planning gain.
Planning gain. Okay. So, so then the question was, the New York Planning Commission wanted to know, well, so what's going on? I mean, so they have built these plazas. Are they working? So he did a wonderful. There's a wonderful video about 50 minutes long, where he looked at systematically with a closed circuit, not closed circuit, I mean time-lapse camera. He watched how the space is being used, did a lot of data collection, and it was a wonderful video. If you haven't seen it, you should take a look at it. It's called The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces. And there's a very nice quote from him in his movie. He says that, it is difficult to design a space that will not attract people. What is remarkable is how often this has been accomplished, right? So this is his sort of commentary about how we have designed public spaces that people don't come to that. It's how we have managed to do that. So what is about the principles of design for social life? He came up with a very simple list. You need seating, ideal movable seating. You need lots of sun. You need food. You need other people there. And there are some other kinds of intangible stuff that can happen, maybe art, object, etc. I think there's a few other things that I didn't include on the list. But the more sort of environment behavior literature perspective, one could say that what are the sort of principles of design for social life? One is provide behavior settings, enough and diverse behavior setting, and other that Roger Barker talks about, and the affordances, which J.J. Gibson, a psychologist, talked about. So here is an example of what a behavior setting is like. This is from Stockholm. On the left-hand side, in the main axis, you have these, this is the summer month, you can have your, get a massage in a nice sunny day, and they're using the sidewalk to, or the young lady in a bollard, which becomes an affordance in the sense it provides an opportunity for the person to rest. And so So the designer, urban designer, we need to sort of find ways to sort of increase the behavior setting, diversity of behavior setting, and also provide the affordances that people like or need when they visit the public spaces. Now, this happens to be outside the Abbey in Bath when I was visiting Bath last. I'm not sure exactly what the occasion was, but this is some kind of a religious communion. People brought the chairs together. They formed a group, held hands, and the prayers, and so for this kind of mid-morning. But that's a kind of a occasion for a social life of public space. That all kinds of things can happen in public space. I thought this was sort of wonderful. Or the death and life of the great American cities that Jane Jacobs talks about. I couldn't show the picture of her street, Hudson Street, but there's some scenes from New York. This is on the left-hand side. It's a Little Italy. There was this Santa Geronimo or some day, and so they've taken over, completely blocked off the streets, and it's all kinds of food and music and like a real sort of fiesta and the kind of wonderful street life. So these are the kinds of events that takes place in public space that defines the urbanism of the city and makes cities the places that we like to see. In the right-hand corner, there is some kind of a Turkish something or other going on. So this guy was singing some Turkish song. The picture below is the Union Square in New York City, which is a wonderful public space where people gather, mainly young people, a lot of universities near there. Now, similarly, you may look at these pictures, and this looks very much like the kind of public spaces we saw. The only big difference that this is that not a single blade of grass in this picture or a single leaf in the tree belongs to public ownership. This is all privately owned. So this is a developer in San Jose. He designed a kind of a 4-block by 4-block complex and housing, shopping, and complete with parks and plazas and noontime concert and things like that. So it's just like any other pictures of the real city that we kind of like. He has provided it. The only thing is not public space. It's a privately owned space. I mean, you are there as a privilege, not as a right. So you cannot exercise all of your other kinds of First Amendment rights and things like that you technically can in a street or in a real public space. Even in the developing countries, this is a new mall in Calcutta or Kolkata. This is the time when the Durga Puja, which is a big festival in the Bengali life. These pujas are actually happens typically in the neighborhood scale, but now this beautiful shopping mall, big shopping mall, one of the largest in India, has now provided a setting for even this religious kind of festival right in the middle. I mean, it's not any different from what goes on in our malls here during the Christmas time, but you don't typically expect to see, Jesus and Mary and all of that sort of stuff in the middle of the mall. Maybe sometimes you do. But anyways, so the one of the things I think, in light of all of these arguments and debate and discussion, that perhaps it is a time to sort of rethink the public space. That's sort of kind of making the argument and draw from some of the arguments that Chris Webster and Shinley and others have made. So normally you have thought about public space as a public good. This is what the economists talk about. And which is the most commonly accepted position in the Western liberal democracy, that public space is a public good. So the public good is a good that cannot be provided in the marketplace, therefore is provided by the government, right, or the state. So the production and consumption of public space is historically justified as a kind of market failure in this sort of non-excludability, non-rival nature. I don't know if you're into that sort of economics stuff. If not, I'm not that great an expert in it. Maybe Yiming in the back there could do explain more on this. But all of that questions are now being challenged. Some of my own colleagues are saying there's nothing that says that the public good, like a park or any other kinds of public space, has to be provided by the government. It could be produced by the market, and it could be as a market good, which means that basically what you have to do is you're going to pay some money to go to the park. The park might be owned by a corporation, and they will manage and maintain it, and the city will not have to do anything, not invest any money, and so forth. So the notion of the park, why can't the park be a private good? Now this is a little bit dangerous, because then it really sort of completely sort of co-opts the notion of the public space as an important kind of a public amenity and a part of the public sphere and the public realm. So I think that new way of thinking needs to be done. So one thinking that I think, again, Chris Webster's work has promoted, the public space, the commons. So the idea of the commons is that these are the resources under collective ownership, like the air we breathe, the ocean, the river. These are all part of the commons. So you all own it. It's not doesn't belong to any individual, or you cannot own a river, or you cannot own a certain amount of air, right? These are all part of the notion of the commons. And I think the environmental policy, they use the term quite often, that the quality of environment is really something that belongs to the commons. But now it's being conceptualized in neoliberal economic literature as the sort of the residual realm that exists once you aggregate all properties in the private ownership. So once everybody has their private properties and so forth, whatever is left is the commons, which is, you can call it public realm, you could call it whatever, and they think that commons can be enclosed or subjected to special rights by which we can provide more efficient kind of services and facilities. Okay, this is a little bit of a complicated argument. I'm probably not doing a very good job simplifying. But the notion of the public space as a common resource is, one could argue, is very much part of the inherent rights of citizenship. But if you think about the public space as the commons, then there are 3 or 4 challenges, and I want to talk about that arises in the future of the commons, the public space of the common. One is the encroachment of the common. Second is the enclosure of the commons. Third is what I call obviation of the commons. And fourth, surveillance of the commons. So these are some of the challenges, I think, that we need to consider and to talk about. So the encroachment of the commons is basically, any kind of enclosure of the commons is also encroachment. So what is sort of what would be sort of an example of a enclosure of the commons? Well, Chris Webster, for example, talks about the gated communities in China, where the old system of social ownership, now that they become privately owned and managed, it's being sort of that whole administrative management is done as a kind of commons, where the property owners themselves sort of manage everything from their open space requirement to their maintenance requirement and all of that sort of stuff. And he sees that this is the way to go. This is the way we can have more efficient distribution of goods and services. Because the problem is that if the common is not fully prescribed, the rights of the common, then it could lead to what Garrett Hardin talks about, the tragedy of the commons. The idea was that if you have a sort of a land for pasture, and then you have a bunch of farmers who are living around it, and if there are no rules of how much one could use or graze, the people would, by rational decision, all individuals will try to maximize, bring in as whatever the herd they have number, and have do the grazing done as much as possible. Get there first and get. But the problem with that, if that happens, then there is a kind of overgrazing, the phenomenon, which leads to the decline of the commons. The grazing land becomes basically, no grass will be growing to keep up with rate with the way it has been grazed, and that leads to sort of what they call the tragedy of the commons. So the Websters and others are arguing that we have a similar problem in the urban commons. Because think about our public spaces, public realm, etc., part of the urban commons, that without any specific rights assigned, we might face a kind of overgrazing of the urban commons and therefore continuing decline of the urban common. So this goes back to my earlier argument that the cities are growing, the open spaces are not being provided or increased. And so the question is, where do people meet the new needs? So I'll give you some examples from Ahmedabad and Calcutta, and also see if you think there is some point there in terms of the tragedy of the commons. So this example, for example, is from the city of Ahmedabad in India. This is it's a bank of a river, Sabarmati River, and the bank of the river. So who does the river belong to? The river belongs to everybody, right? So a river is a classic case of the common, right? And in this case, it happens to be an urban common because it's in the middle of the city. Well, so what's happening here, this is a little bit of old picture, by the way. These squatter settlements and the slum area has now been completely cleared. The government got rid of that, but for a long time, on both sides of the river, the slums and squatter settlements existed for a long time. So basically, one could argue that they are grazing the common, basically. They are taking over the common illegally because they don't have any true rights to use the common. Nobody should be occupying the common like that. But in developing countries, you see often the slums and squatter settlements in a situation like that. Or this is an example of a market scene from Ahmedabad. But again, here you see there's a narrow lane, but obviously the shopkeepers have to sell goods, and they're basically encroaching on the common, right? They're taking and what that means is that the traffic becomes more congested, hard to get through, and so forth. But this is an example of a shopping district. In Calcutta again, in the one district where the potters, they make these images, clay images. Again, they have a large production delivery demand to meet, but their little workshops cannot hold this many sort of images. So they are using the street and the sidewalk to stack their products. So this is a temporary phenomenon, but they're encroaching upon the common, into the street space. But then you see in Calcutta this kind of phenomenon, which is also a kind of an encroachment of the common. It's perfectly good sidewalk, but somebody has hung some, tarpaulin and plastic sheets, and he's not there now, but he'll soon show up. He'll be selling, tea or whatever. It's completely on a public space, on the public realm. So that's kind of an example of this kind of encroachment. This is another very good example of this guy has set up a little stall. This is the local neighborhood ironing guy. So what happens in many of these homes, you do their laundry, either the laundry, your machine, wash machine, or by hand, and then you have it all dried, hung in this thing, but then you need to be ironed. So you send it to this guy, and he irons it for you in the morning. So this almost become a permanent operation in this little neighborhood street. Or selling of vegetables, again on the sidewalk, little produce market that's selling stuff. People come locally, so you don't have to go to the big market. You can buy your stuff right there on your corner of your neighborhood street. And of course, this also is a form of encroachment on the common, because you are, obviously there's not enough parking there, so you use the sidewalk space to park your car. And the demand for parking is increasing, but there's not enough parking space. Or there's other example that's very common in India, is that somebody will come and put a little rock or something in the base of a tree, and then pretty soon it'll become a religious temple kind of thing. And once that happens, that it's very hard to get remove them because it takes on a sacred, holy character land use. So you cannot touch the sacred land use, right? As a planner, you're in trouble. Or the informal economy, which happens not just in India, everywhere in the world. Here in Mexico, the plaza, Zocalo, is being used by the Indian craftspeople who came from outside the city selling their products. This is also a very common scene. But these are all examples of the urban commons being used without any specific rights or sanction, but it depends on the city. If the cities are permissive, they let them do it, but sometimes they might send the police and kind of, get them out of this. If you go to Taipei, you see a lot of, in the main downtown, they sell stuff like, knockoff watches and things like that. They'll see it on the sidewalk, and all of a sudden, somebody would say that the police is coming, and they'll pick up their four corners of the big towel they have and put it on the shoulder and kind of melt into the crowd. And that's how they. But so from time to time, the Taipei government municipality will go after these guys, but most of the time they can do their trade easily. But so the in these instances, however, one could argue that sure, they're doing all of that, they're taking over some of the commons, but perhaps there is some utility to it, there's some social utility to it, there's some public good to it, and that leads to the kind of the urbanism, the verb that generates in some of the cities, make the cities so interesting. But Webster's articles, he is arguing that there is efficient in the production of service and activities through common interest development, which is what he called the enclosure of the common, and through the initial allocation of property rights, and then the collectively private production of what otherwise would have been considered public goods. And even my colleague Peter Gordon at USC wrote this book with Beto, where they promoted the notion of the voluntary city. The city can be managed and organized and produce all the functions managed by voluntary basis by people themselves. You don't have to rely on the government or the public sector. And I talked about the examples from China, which is, Webster very much celebrates that as a way of future of everywhere. Now, I'm going to quickly go through some of these things because these are maybe a little bit more. So the problem of the enclosure of the urban common, in the Shinley and Chris Webster article, they discuss why it is necessary, and if not, it's almost inexorable because otherwise the whole thing fails. And this is not unlike there is the economist named Charles Tibu, who argued, and this applies in American context, in particular Los Angeles, that Los Angeles County, for example, has 88 cities, and in the Southern California region have 156 cities. And so this fragmentation of the political space in Los Angeles is a result of what he called a Tibusian space, because Tibu, with a public choice theory argument, he argued that this is the way the most efficient public services and goods can be provided, not having in one big government, but have it done in smaller units in small government localities, and people can make choice. They can move. So each locality can be seen as if a firm functioning in a political marketplace, and they're selling a particular bundle of goods, a certain level of school district, certain quality of fire services, maybe some set of parks and playgrounds and things like that, mix of housing. And if you like that, you can afford to, and it's all reflected on the rent or your land value you pay, and if you can afford to do that, you move there. So it creates a choice, a market choice, and people sort them in these metropolitan context, and it talks about Tibu sorting and so forth. The problem, however, is that what's wrong with this picture? And the wrong with the picture, but let me go to this second one, is that the Tibu said, one could think of the municipalities as like clubs, and the municipality services are like club goods. So if we, if you belong to a good club, pay the right amount of a membership fee, you can enjoy certain club goods. If you cannot afford that, you can have maybe a little bit lower quality. If you can, so you suit yourself depending on your economic circumstances. You choose what kind of club you do. Except what Tibu never addressed is that yes, there are clubs. Indeed, some of the communities function like clubs. So they are large lot zoned. They have bridle paths and lots of open spaces, and they don't allow any multifamily housing, no social housing, no public. So basically, they're excluding a lot of people. In order to live in that city, you have to be able to have belong to a certain income level that will allow you to buy the kind of large lot zoning. So this is called the exclusionary zoning or snob zoning, which has been challenged even in the Supreme Court by a lot of advocacy planners. But U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that although the discrimination is not allowed by Constitution, you can't discriminate again by race, creed, color, religion, etc. But if community decides to live in the way they want to, they have every right to do that. That's constitutional. So basically what the Supreme Court has said, the economic discrimination is okay. Any other kind of discrimination is not okay. So these are kind of realities. So basically what my colleague Niraj Verma and I did a piece where we talked about how, yes, the clubs too, but there are also soup kitchens, because some communities become the very poor communities. I mean, they have very little facilities or amenities. They have very crowded, high-density living and things like that. And furthermore, I'm going to list one of the most important issue is that there is a sort of kind of a unfair distribution of social responsibilities. So that, Los Angeles County, or, they have something like, let's say, 50,000 homeless people. So the question is, where do the homeless people go? Which community? So a fair share argument would be that, well, every community should take a certain percentage of the homeless people or a certain percentage of their social housing, right? Prorated by their population size, but that doesn't happen. They don't take any social housing, they don't take any homeless people, they don't take any elderly or even elderly in senior housing because they don't like multifamily housing. So there is a kind of so all the homeless people problem and other things belongs to the central city or the large cities, but not the special club cities. So there is those kinds of unfair distributive injustice that take place. Anyway, so the other kind of okay. So the other thing is that, very quickly, the tragedy of the commons, is it inevitable? Well, there are some other economists, Eleanor Ostrom, also a Nobel laureate economist, who has argued that it's not always clear that if you have the commons, they will end up in a tragic situation, because people are smart, they know the limits, and they can organize themselves in a way to minimize or ration the kind of use of the land. So the communities are perfectly capable of managing their common on their own and not acting like this kind of Amartya Sen, another Nobel laureate, talks about the rational fools. So if you have to be you have a rational economic theory of rationality would be you maximize your profit, you maximize your self-interest, but but as Amartya Sen said, the rational fool must be a social moron, because he doesn't realize that there are some social outcomes which his rational choice would not necessarily help. So these are some of the arguments. Also, you know, the Bentler, who is a law professor at Yale, now at MIT, argued that if this is really true, that how do you then explain the open source software development? That if people who can make money by new software they sell in the marketplace, but instead they contribute it to the open source, anybody can use it. So people are not necessarily the kind of the market rational people. They have their other kinds of values and interests and so forth. There is, again, I'm not going to do that. There is also kind of a notion of the tragedy of the anti-commons that Michael Heller, another law professor from Columbia University, argued. And basically is interested how, you know, the people make patents of their innovation, but there are so many patents, especially in the food industry, it becomes very difficult to do some innovative food production because the thicket of typically of the patents make it impossible to do anything productive, and that happens again because the property rights are so much sort of specified. So the enclosure of the urban commons, this is like China, it's happening in India. This is an example of a gated community under construction. The gates are already in, even the walls don't exist, but that's only a matter of time. Or you may see a kind of outcome which is a result of the enclosure of the urban commons. So what is happening here, this is from Rio, the favela on the left hand. This is not a Photoshop job, by the way. This is a true picture. So basically on the left hand side you have the original favela, which are squatters, which you want to talk about encroachment, overgrazing. And the right hand side where the government came and took that property, gave the property rights to the developer. The developer came up with this very fancy condominium with the terrace, the swimming pool and so forth, the tennis court, all of the good stuff, including a great view to boot, which is the view of the, I don't know what the view on the other side looks like. But this is the kind of outcome of polarized, dualistic, antipodic urban outcome that we might face if you have that kind of enclosure. Or this is another example of what happens to the residual commons. If you can close the commons, goes to the gated communities and so forth, what happens to the rest of the urban commons? Because basically the pressure on the urban commons is increasing. And by the way, those folks who live in the gated communities, they're not, unless they're completely recluse and never want to get out of the gated communities, they have to go outside the city. They have to travel to the airport or, you know, go to the hospital or see his doctor or so forth. So how do they travel in the middle of the otherwise very congested urban commons? Well, the economists have answered. You just provide new highways and freeways, which have you pay, they can afford to pay special tolls and so forth. So this is the kind of notion of analogous city. So another kind of city that emerges for the successful, for the rich, for the wealthy. But the poor, those who are not, have been able to afford that kind of enclosure of the common, end up this classic example of the right of way of a freeway above ground. So this is the same kind of antipodic dualistic image that comes. So very quickly then, the third issue of the commons is the obviation of the common, which is a result of the information and communication technology that increasingly we're, just think about it. I mean, you could actually be in a public realm, sitting in your kitchen in your pajamas. You could be participating in some kind of a chat room and blog and so forth, right? On the other hand, you could be in the middle of Grand Central Station or Paddington Station and carry on a very intimate conversation with your girlfriend or boyfriend, but in the middle of a huge public space. So the public-private distinction with the new communication technology is increasingly breaking down and getting conflated. So we are now not only in public space use, but also our budget of public time and social contact is also decreasing. Right now, most of the time we're all, doing text messaging or listening to the. So where is the time to have face-to-face contact? Or even if you have public space, where do you have the time to even say hello to someone, to a stranger, and sit down and have coffee with a stranger? Obviously, you have other things to do, right? And the information communication technology is changing our transformation time budget, and we become increasingly withdrawn to our home, what the Christopher Alexander talked about, autonomy withdrawal syndrome, and the kind of resulting agoraphobia, the fear of being outside in the open space. So the rise of the cyber civitas. So one question, is the rise of cyber civitas and cyber communitas really obviating the argument for the commons? So why are you bothering? Because people don't use public space. So who needs public space, right? And the other thing is, another way of sort of the commons is being challenged is the surveillance. That is, increasingly you are being observed. And I find it very interesting that in UK, nobody is too worried about the fact. London probably has more CCTV cameras than anywhere else, although I haven't seen that many in Cardiff. But people are not worried. But this is what the James C. Scott calls the seeing needs of the state, of the government. So think about it, that this could lead to, again, in the American context, the civil libertarians are very much worried about the Fourth Amendment right. The Fourth Amendment right has to do with search and seizure, or your privacy. That no one can, enter your home and search or seize anything you own without kind of legal and court kind of the summons, so to speak. But when you're out in the public, you are being watched. And so some of the lawyers, they have actually, again, gone to, Americans are really litigious, so they're always challenged. So they went to court, but Supreme Court said that in one case that, well, listen, you leave your Fourth Amendment rights when you leave your home. As soon as you cross the threshold of your front door, you're in public, you don't carry your Fourth Amendment rights. Anybody could take your picture with a camera and so forth. So, but it's one legal scholar is arguing that no, that shouldn't be the case. We should be able to carry our Fourth Amendment rights on person, when you're out in the public. So, let's see. Anyways, let me. Oh, there's first some pictures of surveillance. So, this is a common. What is interesting about this picture is that this is a public space, public park, but the guard is a private guard. So it's not a city policeman sitting there watching. It's a private guard hired by who? Not the city, but the corporations who own the property around this park decided to hire a private guard to keep an eye on this activities in this park. There are many of you from China. Tiananmen Square is one of the largest public square, right? But not always it's open to everybody. This happened to be the day when Vladimir Putin was visiting, so there are a lot of, so it was closed up. I couldn't go in, just to the park. And this is another sort of picture from Tiananmen Square when this is the Tiananmen Square, the protest event. They are going to be, so they're expecting that there'll be a lot of, activities and protests. So there were, this picture, the policemen were catching those with a camera to see what they're taking. And the other picture on the top was very interesting because they had a lot of plainclothes policemen keeping an watch, but in this case they decided to march, so they're marching with their regular friends, even though they're in plain clothes. So their clothes blows the cover, but anyways. And then this is sort of the surveillance, or what they call, Cuff talks about pervasive computing. These are all pictures of Los Angeles. Of course, this is the scene from London. A lot of it has to do with your congestion zone management, but the cameras are there, and they're always sort of watching you in some fashion. In the Berlin subway, it tells you that there is a for your health, your own safety, and all that. But you know the let me see. So I don't know if you can see where these surveillance cameras are. It's very difficult to see them. So there, a few sort of black dots. So you enter it when you expect cameras, but you didn't see any cameras. They're very, very small and hidden very carefully. So this Fourth Amendment business, this gentleman was arguing that even a video archive that includes only a person's movements through public Fourth Amendment, sorry, this thing got a little bit scrambled there, would inevitably reveal much of that he would rather not share with an audience, let alone have incorporated into official records. So a person usually cannot enter a psychiatrist's office, a marriage counseling center, or infertility clinic, except on a public street. So it is often in public that people ask others out on a date, join a religious community, or seek resources in a library for educating themselves about medical concerns or social dilemmas. By contrast, a government agency armed with a comprehensive visual record of our public activities would not have to guess when you might reveal personal information in public, as it could probe our lives easily after the fact and might quickly build a complete picture of who you are, what you do, and you know, whether you want to see a marriage counselor or infertility clinic or whatever that you might be doing. And so he's saying that's none of anybody's business, not the government business. That's my private right to privacy. So, so what should the urban designers, planners do? Well, there are some research I'm very close to finishing on public space that are going on, that are, you know, some study going on, like Matthew Carmona just finished studying every public space in the city, Los Angeles. There are another group that's looking at what is publicness. The argument is that if you can define the publicness, then maybe you can ask the corporations to provide the privatized public space, to provide those criteria. In the U.S., there are a lot of research going on in the health and parks, playground, jogging trails, walkability, but not much on the First and Fourth Amendment rights or social milieu, public space, and things like that. So what should urban designers, planners do? I mean, you want to know. Well, I think that the planners should continue to advocate for the commons. It resists enclosure or encroachment or surveillance of the commons. Not to get co-opted thinking of public space as a public good. Connect to the concept of the rights, freedom, liberty. Reclaim the commons for public purposes. Aspire for convivial public spaces, public life. Create open-minded spaces, not single-minded spaces, as Walsh talks about. Maximize affordance, diversify behavior settings. There's some general principles. So, for example, very quick picture, you know, in an inner city neighborhood in New York, there's not enough parking public space. So on a summer day, they decided to basically close off a street, hang a volleyball net, and here they're playing basketball or volleyball or whatever it might be. Recently, Mayor Bloomberg has started doing some wonderful things. In a summer day, they're closing off Times Square, and there are big screens, and they are showing movies, films, other kinds of performances. All you need to do is bring your lawn chair and find a place, lay, and watch the whole thing. And so the reclaiming the public space is going to redefine the use rights. Here, again, the Broadway has been permanently closed off for vehicular traffic, and converted into the public space is something we can certainly do. A very good example is what is the Highline, called the Highline phenomenon. There was an abandoned railroad track in the west side of Manhattan, which was just collecting rust, and the weeds were growing, and the city decided to take down. And a lot of just local people themselves, including Ed Norton, the famous movie star, who happens to be the grandson of Jim Rouse, who's the developer, famous developer. And Ed Norton became involved. He said, well, this is what my grandfather would have liked to see happen. And so they collected, raised money, and then now this is a wonderful linear park. It's an old railroad track converted into very nicely landscaped, and it's a long kind of pedestrian narrow strip of open space, public space, they create in the middle of the city. And then, so they talk about the highland phenomenon, and they created all this kind of opportunities for people to enjoy public space. And, and it has actually had an interesting stimulating effect on the development. So now the properties on two sides of the Highland corridor has become now desirable properties. So the hotels are going up, office buildings, new condominium towers. So all of a sudden, this is becoming a stimulus to the economic development. Then the other thing I want to finish with by saying, you know, when the cloud touches the ground, and when I walk with John in the downtown London and the city, that there is a sign for the city Wi-Fi zones. So that means you can actually, connect to the free public Wi-Fi. So, you know, the Wi-Fi could be seen as a public good, as a public service. But when that happens, there are other possibilities that we can use the information communication technology to recreate, refocus on the public space. This particular sign in a park in Buenos Aires, not all of their parks, we have a dozen of their parks, have these special Facebook site for that particular park. And you can go to the Facebook site, and you could there's a blog, and you can write whatever you have to write about the park, or you can write about your own community and spirit. So in a way, one could argue that this Facebook, from the Facebook, we might be returned to the Facebook community. Facebook community meaning community of propinquity, meaning face-to-face contact. So let's not. So you know, public space may not be obviated by ICT, as I said before, but it might actually, we might be able to use ICT to promote public space and create a new kind of public life. So that's my last message. Thank you. It's a little longer than.
Thank you very much, Tridib. It's a very wide-ranging and all-encompassing global tour of the issues. We've got time for some questions, so we've got a multicultural audience, who I hope we can take advantage of that. Who'd like to kick off? Mike and then Yiming.
Going back to Chris Webster, one of his defences of the tragedy of the commons is that by restriction you get a better quality of space or common. Now, isn't there one sense in which urban design conventionally or probably traditionally defined as providing spaces of quality which equates to quite expensive public art and other facets of that sort, sort of is complicit in that tragedy, in the sense if it wasn't quite so expensive and it didn't have to incorporate private providers of that quality in producing the space, would we be better off? Wouldn't we be better off if we weren't urban designers in the sense?
Without getting into that kind of enclosure, so are you saying that maybe we should not aim for the high quality space and just?
Well, in the sense it's conceived
Right.
by maybe the general public or even by professionals. They have to provide quality. We have no really very poor institutional mechanisms for keeping that quality through maintenance or these other things.
Well, that's why, I mean, those are usually associated with this sort of private development complexes. So, you know, they have a security guard, they have, obviously they clean and maintain the space, which probably a real public park or space will not be able to quite do. In fact, one of the problems in Los Angeles is that while the city actually likes to have more public spaces, and if somebody donates the land for a small park, they'll like that idea, but then they'll think twice before taking it on, because once it becomes a public park, then you have to provide maintenance. And that's where the budget issue comes in and so forth. So Yeah, so that's right. So the quality space that we like to see as urban designers or things like that, it seems like can only be done in cooperation or co-production with the private sector. So that's a good point. But yeah, okay. You mean?
Yeah, I think my question is, does public necessarily mean free space? I think one issue is public space can possibly be taken advantage of. If we think about the funding of public space, it's usually coming from general taxpayers. But if you have high quality public space, usually the properties nearby tend to benefit from that space. And these tend to be the wealthiest homeowners, property owners.
Right.
So I would say if the state doesn't proactively privatize public space, someone else will do it. And really it's a hard choice for the state.
Yeah, but who will do it anyway? Example would be what?
Well, if we think about Rose Park in Cardiff, if you look at the property price nearby Rose Park, it tends to be like at least 1.5 times of the property price. Well, let's say property price in Bridgetown, let's say, it's like comparison. So it's a big issue. Everyone pays for public space, but a minority benefit from public space.
I mean, one option might be, again, an economist option that, have a user fee. I remember when I first went to China in 1980, when China was still very much a socialist country, I was stunned to hear that in order to go to this park in this park in Shanghai, you had to buy a little ticket to enter the park.
Yeah.
I said, China is a socialist country, communist. Why do you have to pay? Or they had the community libraries, neighborhood libraries. If you take a book out, you have to pay.
Yeah.
A book out, and the very small amount, but you have to pay. And the argument was that that's the way you keep people honest. So if you're taking this to avoid the overgrazing. So you take a magazine out. If you have to pay, you'll be careful about the magazine and you will not tear out the papers and things like that. But if it is free, I mean, you will not return it. And same with the use of the park needs maintenance and so forth. So, you will not throw garbage in the park and so forth. So so I think in case of China, I think there's kind of a long tradition, I think, about controlling the quality in that way. So the user fee is a possibility, and some places they do require user fee.
So we can have public space, but not free space.
Right. What do you mean by free space?
Free space means you don't have to pay.
Oh, yeah. Well, see, yeah, right. So in the Western context, we see public space is a kind of a free public good that you can walk in and out whenever you want. You don't have to pay a little coin machine to get into the park. But that might be a future option. Who knows?
Ian?
I was very interested in your little bit on saying that we should move away from CCTV and stuff like that. I'd be interested to hear how you think you can apply that if you're looking at public spaces in areas where you have high social deprivation or pre-existing crime figures, or also if you're redesigning a public space which has high crime rates, that type of thing. Obviously there's design things you can put in, but without CCTV, how do you get rid of the problem?
No, I think that's a good point, and I think the reason I think in this country and also slowly in the U.S. people are accepting that CCTV is because you become safe from crime, basically. But I think my sense is that actually what started the CCTV, especially in London and in New York, I'm sure there's quite a bit of CCTV, except city doesn't tell you about it. and particularly in the major train stations and things like that, because of the terrorism threat, right? And so, I mean, maybe that's sort of, we have surrendered some of our liberties of freedom. So when you go to the, air travel, you have to go through all the machine and search and all that. We don't take our shoes off and things like that. We don't think twice about that. But in many ways, it is probably unfortunate because in some ways, Al-Qaeda may have, Osama bin Laden's disappearance notwithstanding, may have succeeded in a very interesting way because they have managed by the threat to take away the kinds of liberties and freedom that in the Western countries we used to enjoy. And that's kind of it's a real tragedy, but that's the fact that's what's going on. Now, in terms of you're thinking about the parks and public spaces in low-income areas or drug-infested areas and things like that. In fact, one could argue that for the local residents, it's a necessary deterrent for crime and other things. And that's, of course, the people have ways of covering themselves. There was a case of this little boy who got shot by a vigilant, which was a gated community, and all he was doing is wearing a hood. And the reason he's wearing a hood was cover himself, because there are cameras, and he didn't want to be seen. But that hood became a symbol or icon for this guy, become suspicious of him. So you could see the inner city kids are increasingly they wear this kind of a long hooded T-shirt and stuff like that. So one response to the public CCTV thing might be that even general people might be covering themselves. You might put a wig on, or when you go to see your marriage counselor, or put on glasses, or put a false mustache or beard, and I mean, there's a way you can cover yourself. So what? The CCTV watching you, but you change your appearance. So that's what's going on in the inner city neighborhood. That's what the kids are responding to with the predominance of CCTV cameras and things like that, to hide their identity.
Gareth.
I didn't get any sense from your lecture as to how big a problem this is, whether it's increasing in the States, and whether anyone is having any success in trying to roll it back.
With the CCTV thing, business.
No, I mean the big picture, the privatization of public space.
Well, again, I don't think we have any real sort of empirical data, but in the 90s, when a lot of these sort of writings came out, the critical writings, was when we saw a lot of these, the arguments about the shopping mall and that conflict, the privatized spaces like in downtown and all that, so I don't know how. I mean, obviously, we all know that the cities are bankrupt. They're not financially. They cannot afford to keep up with the need for the public spaces and other things. So they're naturally they're kind of relying on the private sector for the private development. So it has become sort of like a co-production, private-public. But how it is handled, that the city is going to play a major role in that. So in case of San Francisco, for example, they have lots of control and requirement about that, and all sort of oriented towards protecting the public space. So for example, they have the ordinance that was passed some years ago, which is Prop K, which is called the No New Shadows, for example. Have you heard about that, No New Shadows? Well, No New Shadows argument is that if you have a public space and there is a building on one side, an old building, well, that building is casting some shadow in the public space. So that lot is going to be bought by a developer, and the developer is going to build a high-rise building perhaps. But the city would say, that's fine, you can do whatever you want, but make sure the new shadow will not exceed the existing shadow. So that whatever the sun that's available in that public space will not be impaired by the new height of the building. So it has actually led to a huge amount of a secondary industry that they do a lot of these computer simulation of building shadows, and then based on that they kind of come up with the shape of the building and things like that. So, and also San Francisco required the property owners post a sign saying this is a public space open between such and such hours, and you're, and that they follow the rules, that this is the rules. Because sometimes the developers might say, well, okay, I provide a public space, but I'm going to shut it down at 9 o'clock in the evening. But city would say, no, our understanding is that it's open 24 hours. So San Francisco, city like San Francisco actually is very, very tough on the developers, because it's they say that, listen, if you want to build in San Francisco, don't do us any favor. If you don't like our rules, you can take your building, build it in Oakland or Milpitas, and there are also other cities around here. But if you want to build in San Francisco, you better listen to what we want. And they're very strict kind of guidelines and all of that. Yeah.
I'm not from this department, I'm from media scholars, so I was interested in this question of ICTs, using ICTs
Right.
to support the public space. I wasn't quite sure what you meant there. Do you mean just creating physical spaces where people can use ICTs, in which case, is that what you mean by public space?
Well, what we were saying in that argument is that, well, first of all, we're very curious why City of Buenos Aires will have that Facebook address for that public space. So basically what they wanted, one form is to just, and if you go to the Facebook site, you'll find a lot of it is just complaints. The trees need to be cut, there are beer cans, there are these guys, drunk people sitting there, you should get rid of them, those kinds of things. But I think they wanted to more than that, and actually we think they wanted more than that, and which is that, and in some sites, if you visit the site, they will see that the site has become a kind of like a community blog. So basically people have posted their birthday pictures, their picture of their pets, and this and that. So basically it's a forming reconnecting the social community. So the people that are living near that park, they know the park, but they don't know each other. They're never connected. There's no reason to have any social contact. But this Facebook site gives them the opportunity to, first at the social contact at the cyber community level, but hopefully that might lead to, hey, why don't you go have a cup of coffee in the corner coffee shop or something like that. So that might lead to the more face-to-face social contact and reemergence of the community of propinquity. So that's our argument, that the social media could actually, instead of making to become all kind of a cyber community where anybody can belong in the cloud, to a more locally focused, where people can actually talk about their immediate environment, their immediate need. They can contribute to the planning process. They can provide information to the planners. After all, the local people are the experts about what goes on in their environment, and the planners is really an outsider. So it might help the planners to, the participation of the community in the planning process, which most planners value highly, but usually it turns out to be a kind of, you go to an empty church basement and give a talk and people are bored, they're there to have your coffee and donut or whatever you're providing, but there's really no real exchange. But in this case, this could be more bottom-up, ground level expression of people's engagement with their immediate neighborhood and immediate setting.
Okay, I've got 3 more questions. I think we've had it. Oh, 5 more questions. Gentleman on the left here.
I'm also a stranger from the School of Welsh. My question is also on ICT. Part of my research is looking at protests, street protests. And I find that ICT is now being used very strongly to actually get people out onto the street. It's not just done in the ether.
Right.
And things like Facebook,
Right.
Twitter, blogs,
Right.
and established websites will tell you what's happening. Go to a site called Random Wales, about a calendar of protests,
Right.
and links to all sorts of other organisations. People do communicate and do
Yes.
actually then physically get out there as a physical community. Where we always have.
Yeah, in fact, all these of the uprisings in the Middle East was very much promoted by these ICT, and the fact that there is an old Paul Simon song, "Look for America." I don't know, those of you are old enough may remember. There's a one line that says that something like, she said, "The man in gabardine suit is a spy. I told her, be careful, his bow tie is really a camera." Now, this was written in 1969. Well, we don't need a bow tie as a camera. You have your cell phone. So everybody now is potentially is engaged in surveillance. We're actually, so it's not the CCTV on the street corner. All of us are potentially participating in kind of surveillance. So, and in the case of the political protests and movements, I think that played an enormous important role in, particularly in Cairo, Tahrir Square, and later in Libya and other places. In fact, they counted on that. They counted the fact they could post these scenes in the Western media, and they'll pick it up, and then that gives a much larger kind of a global opportunity of local protest that didn't exist before. Yeah,
It happens at the more trivial level in the city centre.
right, yeah.
Hi, I'm from the School of Architecture.
Yes.
And I would like to ask you, is there a rule of thumb regarding the area of regarding the percentage of the total area of the city that public spaces should occupy?
Well, the percentage of area that devoted to public space or considered public realm.
I'm sorry?
So are you asking is there a sort of some indicators about what percentage of space is devoted to the public space?
Yes, according to the area that the city occupies.
Run by the public, the city, not the private public space.
No.
Okay. I think it can be done. I think that's a good argument. But the question is, what do you include? Did you include the streets also, streets and sidewalks, or just
Only pedestrian
parks?
streets.
Huh?
I mean, only pedestrian streets.
Only
because
pedestrian
streets
streets.
are not really up, because they're allocated to the cars. So
Yeah.
they're not really-
Yeah, no, I think that's an empirical question. It can certainly be measured, and with the Google Street Map these days, you can do that. This will still take time, but at least you don't have to wander around in the rain and things like that. You can do it in your living room, take counts of and whether that actually reflects the city's quality of life and the city's urbanism. I think it's a good question. Does it really matter? Do you judge a city by the quality and amount of public space, or good shopping malls and shopping streets and movie theaters and other kinds of things?
Okay, last 3 questions. Lady back there. Yes, you?
Oh, myself.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's
So,
you.
rather reflection and question. So you present a very interesting picture of how private spaces effectively become symbolic common spaces, public spaces. And I do have a reflection based on my case study and my research, where effectively these spaces become dead. So in my research, I'm looking at a situation where a site is privately owned, but the function is decided by a public within a formal planning process. A public doesn't allow developer to get planning permission effectively, and these sites are closed. So I was wondering, how would you position sort of struggles between public and private within the planning system in the context of public acquiring the right to private.
In the context of public's right?
Yeah, because you were talking like sort of struggle between like a symbolic ownership
Yeah.
and real ownership,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
So my case shows that we can get an access from symbolic ownership to semi-real ownership through the planning system, through
Yeah.
democratic processes.
Well, this is what some of these research going on at Bartlett School. They are trying to define, is there a kind of a publicness quality that could be isolated from the ownership issue, right? Whoever. There is also the related concept of public life. So, does public life, quality of public life has to depend on quality of public space, or it may, I mean, we define the quality of public life by, you know, a good bar or a Starbucks or a coffee shop. All of those are privately owned spaces, but their proximity, their interaction in the public space probably makes a difference. And I have argued in one of the articles that the planner should really focus on public life rather than public space. And if you do that, it's not that public space doesn't become important, but it also makes you think about what kinds of activities and events and land use should be in the context of the public space and so forth. So, but the research that these folks are doing, I think they're trying to sort of isolate those indicators of publicness, and they think that if they can do that, then that could be the requirement that the city planning department then could say that you need to do X, Y, and Z, maybe a number of trees or a number of benches or whatever that might be, or maybe you'll have to give people a chance to have a bake sale or something like that to raise money, or hand out political handouts, handbills and things like that, because that's what you'll be able to do in a real public space, or provide a space where, like in the Hyde Park corner, you have a kind of soapbox where people can get up and do his speech. If a developer can let this happen, then he has basically satisfied a lot of the requirements of publicness. So it doesn't matter if it's a privately owned space. I don't know. We'll have to see that.
Caroline, did you want to?
It was a reflection on your comment on ICT and social media, and the concept of cyber civitas and cyber communities. And it's all very well to begin to germinate a community with a Facebook page on a public space which is emerging. But if that doesn't really consider online behaviour across different platforms, as contrasted with lived experience, and two very different. And part of online existence is so that you don't have to really be there.
Yeah.
So that changes. How far is your research looking at different behaviours across different platforms?
Yeah. In this article, we do talk about some of the platform constraints. I mean, one of the things about the platforms that they are, they're also commercial platforms. They're selling products, right? So once you have access to some of the platforms, then you'll have to tolerate the pop-ups and things like that comes up all the time. So that's really not quite truly a public. So there is a interesting question about whether, I don't know the London City Wi-Fi system, how that works, but if it's truly a public Wi-Fi, right, so it's a public good, it's a public service the city is providing, and it might have, and there is a question of, the censoring, that's always a problem, how we manage that, in terms of, like this YouTube incident where somebody posted that 5-minute video of, which is very objectionable to the Islamic community, that led to riots, fires, people died, you know, but in the U.S., they defended him, saying that that's his First Amendment right. But the YouTube, who could be liable for letting that thing, so YouTube could control that. So no, we're not going to let you post that particular video there. So I think there's a kind of a fine line that they haven't quite figured out exactly where you sort of. I listened to Salman Rushdie in one of these interviews. He said about this YouTube incident. He said that, you know, this is a stupid, gross, you know, terrible movie. I mean, there's no redeeming quality to it. The guy is stupid, you know, but that's his First Amendment right, you know. So you have to. You value your First Amendment right. You have to live with those kinds of operational kind of thing. But so the question is where you draw the line. Whether at some point in some of the platforms there will be more. Then you need somebody who can sort of control what you're posting or communicating. Is that how sort of what you're?
Well, it's a different form of exchange, isn't
Yeah.
it? Because the way each of those platforms is manipulated or consumed or exchanged or whatever it is so, in many ways, infinite.
Yeah.
And really has no relation to how you might interact with somebody if you're having a coffee in a sanctioned behaviour.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Face to face.
So I'm just a little bit. I was just wondering how, you know, we will regularly see in my day job schemes where the public engagement on space will include a Facebook page.
Yeah.
Which is utterly meaningless. And a large
Yeah.
part of a new community which is meant to be generated simply doesn't exist.
Right.
And that use of social media in that way will have no impact whatsoever.
Right.
Alternatively, something organic may spring up entirely differently where media platforms have been crucial. Right. I just wondered if the research
I understand. Yes.
bringing those things up.
Right. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that myself because I don't know how. I mean, there could be. It could be quickly get out of hand because they're just both in terms of the numbers and quality of these exchanges might be making it basically meaningless kind of a conversation, or if not a kind of very objectionable kind of unpleasant kind of thing that as a planner you don't want to get involved in that. If somebody, right? I mean, every morning you open your thing and somebody's complaining about this or that. Who needs it, right? You have enough worries in your day job.
Okay, last question, Anna.
Just there's a question about the difference between like propinquity and like being shows a virtual community in the sense of being in the same space but not having social interaction. Have you done some? Because in a way, I think there's a little bit of romanticism as well in a public space, just without going back to the Greek or something like that. But there's quite a lot of work which is talking about spatial proximity and social kind of distance in a way. And in that sense, have you done some work on the kind of like, okay, we have those fantastic public space beyond the economic values? I mean, I think the economists are reducing economics to use value is a reduction because I mean there's a lot of value in non-use value or other type of value. But at the heart of your kind of argument, there is this kind of like almost like automatic thinking about propinquity and social interaction, which so far hasn't been demonstrated.
Right. Well, I think the real argument about this kind of narrative of loss about propinquity that we are increasingly becoming us in a very diverse, multicultural, multi-economic community. We are becoming increasingly isolated. I mean, what are the chances that you might go to a coffee shop and have a cup of coffee with a guy who drives the garbage truck, for example, and you are a college professor? I mean, are there possible, and it's the Richard Sennett who addresses that, but isn't that part of the democratic society and the democracy and democratic space, that where you can have that chance encounter of somebody who's very different from you. But you learn something about his life, his worries, his complaints. He learns something about you. And this is how you develop the notion of the social contract. After all, we all follow some kind of a social contract to behave ourselves and do the right things. But if we don't have a social contract, how do we actually have that kind of relationship? So that's and this again, Senate also talks about the fall of public man, that increasingly we're becoming sort of private person in our own circuits of environment, and rarely we do go out anywhere where you can run into. I mean, it happens occasionally. I mean, like that marathon the other day, when there can see all these people came, and or if you go to a football game, or you're sitting next to a stranger and you chit chat, and even though maybe supporter of the wrong team, but you
yes,
can.
in a way, here we kind of like move from the space
Right.
to the kind of social side, and there's a limit to what space can do, and at one point it's completely social.
Yeah.
Because you can be in the same space and still not talk to each other.
Right.
So what makes that?
That's well, right. Then the other thing, again, we kind of learned the other day from the field trip, for example, this is the Millennium Village, right?
Mm-hmm.
That apparently we noticed that they didn't really seem to have any. Well, they have some nice garden and stuff at the upper level, but they didn't seem to have any common place of gathering and so forth. But each block has an enormous variety of income mix, from very expensive penthouse to fairly affordable housing. So this is an example of people living in a kind of a block of housing. I don't know how many, 300 or 400 units maybe in each block. So there is a chance of that having kind of a cross income class, but none of that happens. But in a way, however, it happens through social media. Apparently, there are a lot of email exchanges take place between them, and people are in touch with each other through email, but they don't have any face-to-face contact. And maybe the reason they don't have it because the class difference is so huge that maybe it'll be an awkward kind of thing. So this romanticized notion of having a tea with a man who drives the garbage truck, maybe Richard Sennett's kind of romantic notion, but in reality it may not work. So that's why social media works better. So I don't know. I mean, as I said, that it's some of it might be a little bit romantic, but if you talk to these folks, they're very, very strongly believe that all of those are the conditions of a true democratic society, and we must be, as planners and urban designers, we must pay attention to those kinds of requirements and needs and so forth. So,
Thank you. I think we need to stop there. I'm sure you're going to run out of voice in a moment.
yeah.
Just to thank you very much for a very erudite and fantastic range of source material that you've assembled. I hope we can make use of that in our discussions later, particularly in MA Urban Design. But I think you really exposed all of the issues, both sides of the issues really, and it is an inexhaustible subject that you could go on debating forever really. But at the end of the day, it comes down to your own urban experiences. And having just come back from London, where we didn't actually get stopped for the first time I've ever run a field trip, and our group didn't get stopped in the public realm by someone who thought it was the private realm, was extremely gratifying on one level. But of course,
this one gentleman was watching you at this little market.
Yes.
The guard was kind of hovering around and. But looking very menacing.
We made our escape just in time,
right.
yeah. But I mean, these issues are very live, very important, and I think your manifesto for urban designers to defend public space is something we'll all take away. So thank you very much.
Thank you.